He was there with his mistress, thinking his wife was too simple for that world, until she walked in wearing gold and made the entire ballroom stop in silence. Richard Miller stood in front of the walk-in closet mirror, adjusting the bow tie of his custom-made black tuxedo. His fingers trembled slightly as he tried to tie the perfect knot. It wasn't nervousness about the event itself. He had participated in dozens of gala dinners for the Entrepreneurs Association. It was something else that made him restless, a decision he had been making for weeks and that he knew was completely wrong. 2 yards away, Rachel Oliver was finishing her makeup in the bathroom of the hotel suite. She had insisted they get ready separately, away from the eyes of Allison, Richard's wife. Rachel knew exactly what she was doing. At 28, she had a striking beauty that contrasted drastically with Allison's simplicity. Platinum hair, exuberant curves, always dressed to make an impact. "Honey, how do you think I look?" Rachel appeared at the bathroom door, wearing a low-cut red dress that left little to the imagination. The fabric clung to her body like a second skin, and Richard felt a tightening in his chest. It wasn't desire, it was pure embarrassment. It's fine," he replied, avoiding looking directly at her. Richard's phone rang at the exact moment he finished getting ready. It was Allison. He looked at the screen for a few seconds before answering, as he always did lately, as if every conversation with his wife were a burden he carried. "Hi, Allison." "Richard, I just got a call from Sandra. She said she saw you confirming your attendance for the association dinner tonight. I thought you said you weren't going." Richard closed his eyes. He had lied to Allison about the event, saying it had been canceled. The truth was that he didn't want to take his wife. In recent months, Rachel had planted the idea in his head that Allison was too simple for that environment, that she didn't fit into the sophisticated business world, that he deserved someone more glamorous by his side. "Oh, yeah, it was a last-minute decision. They rescheduled, and I thought it best to just go alone. You know how it is. It's going to be a boring night of work." The silence on the other end of the line lasted too long. Richard could imagine Allison in the kitchen at home, still wearing her usual apron, trying to process another lie from her husband. "I see," she said finally. Richard noticed the hurt in her voice. "So you're going alone?" "Yeah, it'll be better that way. We'll talk when I get home, okay?" When he hung up the phone, Richard found Rachel observing him with an expression of ill-disguised satisfaction. She approached and adjusted his tie with her long, red-painted nails. "You made the right choice, love. Tonight you'll see how good it is to have a real woman by your side at an important event." On the other side of the city, Allison Miller hung up the phone and stood still in the kitchen for several minutes. 12 years of marriage had taught her to read between the lines. Richard was lying, and she knew exactly why. In the last 6 months, he had become increasingly distant, increasingly absent. He came home late, invented work trips that made no sense, and when he was present, he seemed to be always thinking of somewhere else. Allison was not naive. She knew there was another woman. She had seen the messages on his phone when he left it unlocked. She had noticed the different perfume on his clothes. She had noticed how he avoided touching her, how he looked away when she tried to talk about their future as a couple. She walked to the bedroom and opened the wardrobe. Way in the back, wrapped in plastic, was the gold dress she had bought 2 years ago for their wedding anniversary. Richard had canceled the dinner at the last minute, claiming work problems. The dress had never been worn. Allison took the dress off the hanger and held it against her body, looking in the mirror. At 30, she maintained a natural and elegant beauty. She wasn't the type of woman who drew attention through vulgarity, but she had a genuine class that came from within. Natural brown hair, expressive eyes, a smile that had once been the most beautiful thing in the world to Richard. The phone rang again. It was Carla, her best friend since high school. "Allison, did you see Rachel's story?" She posted a photo all dressed up, saying she's going to an important event tonight. Allison felt her stomach churn. Rachel Oliver, the secretary Richard had hired 8 months ago. A woman Allison had met only once, briefly, but who had left an unpleasant impression. There was something in the way Rachel looked at Richard, as if he were a trophy to be displayed. "Carla, I need to tell you something. Richard lied to me. He said he wasn't going to the association dinner today, but I just found out he is. Do you think?" "I'm certain. He's taking her." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. Carla had known Allison for over 20 years. She had seen her fall in love with Richard in college, had been the maid of honor at the wedding, and had followed all the ups and downs of the relationship. "Allison, you can't let this pass. You are his wife. You have every right to be at that event." "I know, but it's too humiliating. Imagine me arriving there and finding the two together." "Is it humiliating for you or for him?" Carla's question echoed in Allison's mind after they hung up. She stared at the gold dress for several minutes. It was a beautiful, elegant piece that enhanced her figure without vulgarity. It had cost a fortune at the time, but Richard hadn't even noticed when she mentioned the purchase. Allison made a decision. She wasn't going to stay home one more night waiting for crumbs of attention from her husband. If he wanted to compare, let him compare. But it was going to be an equal match. Meanwhile, Richard and Rachel arrived at the Palazzo Hotel, where the annual Entrepreneurs Association dinner was taking place. The venue was stunning, with crystal chandeliers, Italian marble, and a panoramic view of the city. It was exactly the kind of environment Rachel loved. Sophisticated, expensive, full of important people. "Wow, honey, what an incredible place." Rachel sighed, holding Richard's arm possessively as they climbed the main staircase. "Imagine if you had brought that wife of yours. She would feel so out of place here." Richard forced a smile, but inside, he was feeling increasingly uncomfortable. As he greeted colleagues and acquaintances, he noticed the discreet glances Rachel received. They weren't looks of admiration. They were looks of questioning, of surprise, some even of disguised disapproval. Charles Drummond, his partner of 15 years, approached with his wife, Marcia. It was a couple who had known Allison since the beginning of Richard's marriage. "Richard, good to see you here," Charles greeted, but his gaze was visibly confused. "Where's Allison?" Marcia was looking forward to chatting with her. "Allison couldn't come. Last-minute issues," Richard lied, feeling his face heat up. "This is Rachel, my executive assistant." Rachel extended her hand with an exaggerated smile, but Marcia only greeted her politely before moving away with her husband. Richard noticed the discreet whispering between them and felt a wave of regret. "Why didn't you introduce me as your girlfriend?" Rachel whispered in his ear, clearly irritated. "Rachel, please, not here. This is a professional environment." "Are you ashamed of me?" The question hit Richard like a punch to the stomach, because the answer was yes. He was beginning to be ashamed, not of Rachel as a person, but of the whole situation. The lie to Allison, the way Rachel behaved, the way he was behaving himself. Dinner was served at 8 in the evening. Richard and Rachel were placed at a table with other businessmen from the sector, all accompanied by their legitimate wives. Throughout the meal, Richard felt like a fish out of water. Rachel spoke too loudly, laughed too loudly, and made inappropriate comments about other guests. "Honey, did you see the size of that woman's neckline at table 5? Rachel commented, in a tone several people could hear. "Looks like she's competing with me." Richard cringed in his chair. Across the table, Dr. Peterson, one of the most respected businessmen in the association, exchanged a significant look with his wife. Richard had known them for years and knew they adored Allison. They always praised her upbringing, the elegant way she conducted herself at social events. It was then that he realized he had made the biggest mistake of his life. At 9:30, There was a discreet commotion at the entrance of the main hall. Some people stopped talking and looked toward the door. Richard, who was trying to convince Rachel to drink less, didn't notice initially. It was Charles who caught his attention, lightly touching his shoulder. "Richard, you won't believe who just arrived." When Richard turned to look, he felt as if the world had stopped spinning. There was Allison, standing at the entrance of the ballroom, wearing the most stunning gold dress he had ever seen in his life. She was simply radiant. The dress enhanced every curve of her body in an elegant and sophisticated way. Her hair was pulled back in a low bun that left her neck exposed, and she wore pearl earrings that Richard had given her as a gift on their first wedding anniversary. But it wasn't just her beauty that left Richard breathless. It was her posture. Allison walked through the ballroom with a confidence and elegance that he had forgotten she possessed. She greeted people with genuine smiles, hugged acquaintances, and talked naturally. It was as if she belonged to that place more than anyone else in the room, including himself. "Who is that?" Rachel asked, noticing how Richard was hypnotized by the woman in gold. Richard couldn't answer. His throat was closed. His hands were trembling. For the first time in months, he was seeing Allison for who she really was. An extraordinary, elegant, sophisticated woman whom he had traded for a cheap illusion. The Palazzo Hotel ballroom buzzed with the animated conversations of the 200 most influential guests in the city's business world. Richard tried to focus on the conversation about corporate mergers happening at his table, but his eyes couldn't stop wandering through the room. Every time he looked at Rachel, he felt a growing tightness in his chest. Her red dress, which he had found attractive at the hotel, now seemed far too garish for that sophisticated environment. "Richard, are you okay? You seem distracted," commented Dr. Henry Peterson, the president of the association, a 70-year-old man who commanded an empire of private hospitals. His wife, Mrs. Helen, observed Rachel with an expression of ill-disguised curiosity. "I'm great, Dr. Peterson. Just admiring the decor," Richard lied, forcing a smile while taking another sip of red wine. Rachel, who was sitting next to him, leaned forward in a way that made her neckline even more evident. "Dr. Peterson, isn't it? Richard has told me a lot about you. What an honor to meet such an important person." Rachel's excessively syrupy tone made several people at the table exchange discreet glances. Dr. Peterson only smiled politely before resuming conversation with other guests, but Richard noticed the discomfort in the air. "Rachel, could you speak a little lower?" Richard whispered in her ear, trying to keep a casual tone. "Why? I'm being polite," she replied at a volume several people could hear. "Or are you ashamed of me, Richard?" The question echoed across the table, creating an awkward silence. Marcia Drummond, the wife of Richard's partner, looked down at her plate, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Charles, who had known Richard for 15 years, cleared his throat nervously. "Rachel, it's not that. It's just that this environment calls for a bit more discretion," Richard tried to explain, feeling sweat begin to form on his forehead. "Discretion." Rachel let out a laugh that was too loud. "Honey, if you wanted discretion, you should have brought your wife. I'm not the type to stay quiet in a corner." The comment dropped like a bomb on the table. Several people stopped eating and looked directly at Rachel, then at Richard. The silence that followed was so dense Richard could hear his own breathing. It was Dr. Peterson who broke the silence, but his voice was notably colder. "Richard, we have known you and Allison for years. We have always greatly admired the couple you two make. She is an exceptional woman." "It's true," Helen Peterson agreed, casting a look that left no doubt about what she was thinking. "Allison has a natural elegance that is rare to find these days." Richard felt as if he were being judged by a tribunal. Every word of praise for Allison was like a knife to his conscience. He looked around the table and realized he had completely lost the respect of those people, not for his business or professional competence, but for the man he was revealing himself to be. Well, she has a high fever today. That's why she couldn't come. Richard lied once more, his voice coming out weaker than he intended. Rachel, who was clearly bothered by the praises for Richard's wife, decided to call attention to herself again. Everyone, you'll love to know that Richard and I are planning to travel to Miami next month. He said he wants to introduce me to his international partners. The lie came out of Rachel's mouth with such naturalness that even Richard was shocked. He had never mentioned anything about Miami, let alone about introducing her to business partners. But before he could deny it, she continued. He said he needs a more modern woman by his side to impress the foreigners, someone who really understands the corporate world. Charles Drummond almost choked on his wine. Marcia looked at her husband with an expression of total incredulity. Dr. Peterson and his wife exchanged a look that spoke louder than 1,000 words. "Interesting," said Helen Peterson, her voice loaded with ill-contained sarcasm. "And what exactly do you do in the corporate world, dear?" Rachel didn't notice the tone of the question and responded enthusiastically. "I've been Richard's executive assistant for 8 months. I take care of all his important appointments, organize his schedule, answer important calls. I practically manage his professional life." "Ah, I see." Helen nodded slowly. "And before that, what was your experience in the field?" "Well, I worked as a receptionist in a dental clinic, but I always knew I had potential for bigger things. When I met Richard, he soon realized I would be perfect for the position." The table went silent once more. Richard wanted to disappear. He wanted the floor to open up and swallow him. Every word that came out of Rachel's mouth made him look more pathetic, more irresponsible, more unworthy of the respect he had taken years to build in that environment. Dr. Peterson stood up from the table, his expression serious. "Richard, I need to talk to you about that hospital project. Could you join me on the balcony for a few minutes?" It wasn't an invitation. It was an order disguised as politeness. Richard stood up, his legs trembling slightly, and followed the most powerful man in the association to the hotel's outer balcony. The cold night air hit Richard's face like a slap. Dr. Peterson positioned himself at the balcony railing, looking at the illuminated city below. For a few minutes, they stood in silence. "Richard, you'll excuse my frankness, but I need to say this as a longtime friend," Dr. Peterson began, without taking his eyes off the landscape. "What is happening to you?" "I don't understand, Dr. Peterson." "You understand perfectly." The older man turned to face him. "For 15 years you have participated in these dinners. You always brought Allison. You always behaved like a gentleman. Now you show up here with this girl, lying about your wife being sick. Richard, don't come at me with lies. Helen called Allison yesterday to confirm if she was coming today. Allison said she didn't even know about the event." Richard's world collapsed at that moment. He had been caught in another lie, and this time, by people whose respect was fundamental to his business. "Dr. Peterson, I can explain." "You don't need to explain anything to me, Richard. Your personal life is your responsibility, but I'm going to give you a piece of advice from someone who has lived a long time. You are destroying something precious for a cheap illusion." Meanwhile, back in the ballroom, Rachel was feeling increasingly uncomfortable at the table. The other women treated her with a frozen politeness, and the men barely looked in her direction. She decided to go to the bathroom to touch up her makeup and, as a bonus, post some photos on social media to show where she was. In the hotel bathroom, Rachel found other guests of the event touching up their makeup. She tried to strike up a conversation, but realized the women were purposely avoiding her. "What a beautiful dress," Rachel commented to an elegant lady next to her at the mirror. "Thank you," the woman replied dryly, without looking at Rachel. "Do you know Richard Miller? We're a couple. He's introducing me to all his friends today." The woman stopped applying lipstick and looked directly at Rachel through the mirror. "I've known Richard and Allison for over 10 years. They are one of the most beautiful couples I've ever met." The comment was like a bucket of cold water. Rachel felt her face heat up, but she tried to maintain her pose. Well, things change, right? Sometimes people grow and realize they deserve something better. True, the woman agreed, putting her lipstick back in her purse. Sometimes people realize exactly what they deserve. The way she said it made Rachel realize it wasn't a compliment. When the woman left the bathroom, Rachel stood alone before the mirror, starting to question if she was interpreting the situation correctly. Back on the balcony, Dr. Peterson continued his frank conversation with Richard. "Do you know what worries me most, Richard? It's not even the fact that you're having an affair. Men make mistakes. It's human nature. What worries me is how you're handling it." "How so?" "You're lying to everyone, including yourself. You're bringing your mistress to social events where your wife should be. You're making a fool of her in front of people who respect you and your family. Richard, you're making a fool of Allison, a woman who has always supported you, who has always been by your side, whom we all admire and respect." "Dr. Peterson, things between me and Allison have been complicated for a while." "Complicated how, Richard?" "Because from what I see, you've had a solid marriage for 12 years. Allison is an extraordinary, intelligent, elegant woman. What exactly is complicated?" Richard didn't know how to answer because he didn't have a real answer. Things weren't bad with Allison. He had simply let himself be carried away by the novelty, by the adulation of a younger woman, by the illusion that he deserved something more exciting. "Look, Richard, I'm going to be straight with you. If you want to end your marriage, end it. Be man enough to face the consequences. But don't do what you're doing. Don't humiliate your wife publicly. Don't destroy your own reputation for a fling." When they returned to the ballroom, Richard found Rachel clearly irritated at the table. She had drunk more wine, and her voice was slightly altered. "Where were you, honey? You left me alone here with these people who barely speak to me," she complained loudly enough for several people to hear. "Rachel, please, let's keep the tone down," Richard asked, sitting beside her. "Why is everyone here so weird? They keep looking at me like I'm an alien. And those women in the bathroom, so stuck up." Marcia Drummond coughed discreetly and turned to her husband, whispering something in his ear. Charles looked at Richard with an expression of pity mixed with disapproval. It was at that moment that there was a discreet commotion at the entrance of the ballroom. Some people stopped talking and turned to look toward the main door. Richard, absorbed in trying to control Rachel, didn't notice initially. "My God," Helen Peterson whispered to her husband. "Look who arrived." Charles Drummond turned to follow her gaze, and his eyes widened. "Richard," he said, touching his friend's arm. "Richard, look at the entrance." When Richard raised his eyes, he felt as if he had received an electric shock. There was Allison, standing at the entrance of the ballroom like a golden apparition. The dress she wore was simply stunning, an elegant model that enhanced her figure in a sophisticated way, without vulgarity. Her hair was styled in an impeccable low bun, and she wore subtle makeup that highlighted her expressive eyes. But it wasn't just her physical beauty that left Richard breathless. It was the way she presented herself. Allison walked through the hall with a natural confidence, greeting acquaintances with genuine smiles, talking with ease with people whom Richard knew admired her. It was as if she belonged to that place more than anyone else there, including himself. "Who is that woman?" Rachel asked, following Richard's gaze. Everyone stopped to look at her. Richard couldn't answer. His throat was closed. His heart was beating fast. For the first time in months, he was seeing Allison for who she really was, an extraordinary woman whom he had been stupid enough to betray. And she was walking directly toward their table. Allison stopped at the entrance of the main ballroom and took a deep breath. Her heart was beating fast, but it wasn't fear she felt. It was pure determination. During the drive from home to the hotel, she had passed through all possible emotional stages, anger, sadness, humiliation, and finally, a resolute calm that surprised her. The security guard at the entrance of the hall looked at her with some hesitation. He was a tall, middle-aged man who clearly had strict instructions on who could or could not enter the event. "Good evening, ma'am. May I see your invitation?" Allison smiled with the serenity she didn't know she possessed. "I don't have a physical invitation, but I am Allison Miller, Richard Miller's wife. He's already inside." The guard consulted a list on his tablet, frowning. "I don't see your name on the confirmed list, Mrs. Miller." "That's because my husband only confirmed for himself. I had a change of plans and managed to come at the last moment." Allison raised her left hand, showing her wedding ring. "As you can see, I really have been his wife for 12 years. There was something in Allison's posture, in the confident way she spoke, that made the guard hesitate. He looked again at the ring, then at her face, clearly trying to make a decision. "Ma'am, I understand the situation, but I have protocols to follow." "Of course you do," Allison agreed, keeping her tone polite, but firm. "And I respect that completely. How about you call Dr. Henry Peterson? He has known me for years and can confirm who I am." The mention of the association president made the guard straighten up. He knew he couldn't just call Dr. Peterson during the event without a good reason, but he also didn't want to create a problem with the wife of one of the most important members. "One moment, please," he said, picking up the radio. After a brief conversation in codes with someone on the other end, he turned to Allison again. "You may enter, ma'am, but I'll need someone from the organization to accompany you to your husband." "Perfectly understandable," Allison replied, smoothing her gold dress. "I appreciate your understanding." When the doors to the hall opened completely, and Allison took the first step inside, it was as if a wave of energy swept through the room. The gold dress caught the light from the crystal chandeliers in an almost magical way, creating a soft glow that made her look like an ethereal apparition. The fabric flowed with every movement, hugging her curves elegantly, without being vulgar. It was a dress that spoke of class, of sophistication, of a woman who knew her own worth. The pearl earrings Richard had given her on their first anniversary caught the light and framed her face perfectly. But it wasn't just physical appearance that was causing an impact. It was the way Allison moved. There was a natural confidence in every step, an innate elegance that couldn't be bought or imitated. It was the type of presence that made people naturally stop to look, not out of provocation or exhibitionism, but out of pure admiration. The first people to notice her entry were Helen and Dr. Peterson. Helen was in the middle of a conversation about contemporary art when she saw Allison and literally stopped mid-sentence. "Henry," she whispered to her husband, gently touching his arm. "Look who arrived." Dr. Peterson turned, and a genuine smile lit up his face. In 15 years of social interaction, he had always had a special admiration for Allison. She was the type of woman who elevated any environment she was in. "Helen, let's go greet her," he said, already heading toward Allison. The movement of the Petersons created a domino effect. Other people began to notice and turned to see who had arrived. A murmur of recognition ran through the tables near the entrance. "It's Allison Miller," someone commented. "Wow, how elegant she looks." "She's always been a stunning woman," another voice agreed. "And what a wonderful dress." Allison walked slowly through the ballroom, nodding discreetly to acquaintances, smiling at people who greeted her. Every step was calculated, not out of nervousness, but out of a natural elegance that was part of her personality. Dr. Peterson was the first to reach her, extending both hands in a warm greeting. "Allison, my dear, what a wonderful surprise. Helen and I were commenting earlier about your absence." "Dr. Peterson, what a pleasure to see you," Allison replied, accepting the greeting with a genuine smile. "I managed to resolve some last-minute commitments and decided to come. I hope I'm not disrupting anything." "Disrupting? Dear, You are lighting up the whole room." Helen joined her husband, kissing Allison on the cheek with genuine affection. "And this dress is simply divine. You look radiant." "Thank you very much, Helen. You are always so kind to me." Other people began to approach, forming a small circle around Allison. They were couples who had known her for years, people who had always admired her, but hadn't seen her at social events for some time. "Allison, good to see you," exclaimed Marcia Drummond, who had left her table to greet her friend. "Charles and I were commenting that we missed you at the recent events." "Hi, Marcia. How good to find you here," Allison replied, hugging the woman sincerely. "How are the kids?" "Great. By the way, Sophia always asks about you. She said she wants to be elegant like Aunt Allison when she grows up." The greetings continued for several minutes. Allison talked naturally about family, work, travel, art. It was evident to everyone that she not only belonged in that environment, but was one of the most admired people present. On the other side of the room, Richard watched the whole scene as if in a trance. Every greeting Allison received, every smile directed at her, every word of admiration was like a knife to his conscience. "Richard, are you okay? You turned pale," Rachel commented, following his gaze. "Who is that woman causing all this stir?" Richard tried to answer, but the words were stuck in his throat. How to explain that stunning woman, admired by everyone, was his wife? The same wife he had considered too simple for that environment? It's Allison," he finally managed to say, his voice coming out as a hoarse whisper. "Allison who?" Rachel asked, still not making the connection. "My wife." The silence that followed at the table was absolute. Rachel looked again at the woman in gold, then at Richard, then back to Allison. Her expression gradually changed from curiosity to incredulity, then to something that looked like panic. "That's your wife? The one you said was sick?" Charles and Marcia Drummond, who had returned to the table after greeting Allison, heard Rachel's comment. Charles cast a stern look at Richard, while Marcia simply shook her head in disapproval. "You lied about your wife being sick?" Dr. Peterson, who had returned to the table, asked with a voice that left no doubt about his opinion of the situation. Richard felt like a criminal being judged. Everyone at the table now knew he had lied, that he had brought his mistress to an event where he should have been with his wife. "Dr. Peterson, I can explain." "You don't need to explain anything to me, Richard," the older man replied coldly. "Your choices speak for themselves." Meanwhile, Allison continued her walk through the hall, greeting people, talking briefly with each group. But her eyes discreetly searched for Richard. She knew exactly where he was sitting. She knew he was watching her, but she wanted the moment of their meeting to be perfect. "Allison, you need to meet the wife of Henry's new partner," Helen Peterson said, guiding her toward a nearby table. "She's passionate about art, just like you." For the next 15 minutes, Allison circulated the ballroom like a queen. There was no arrogance or pretension in her behavior, just a natural confidence that drew people in. She talked about painting with the wives of the businessmen, discussed investments with the businessmen themselves, and demonstrated knowledge on the most diverse subjects. It was impossible not to notice the glaring contrast between her and Rachel. While Rachel tried to draw attention through vulgarity and scandal, Allison commanded respect through elegance and intelligence. "That's Richard Miller's wife," someone commented at a nearby table. "I've always thought she was one of the most refined women who attend our events." "True," another person agreed. "She has a natural class that's rare these days." Rachel heard the comments and felt a mixture of anger and insecurity growing inside her. For months, Richard had described Allison as a simple woman, without sophistication, who didn't fit in his world. But the woman dominating that ballroom was anything but simple. "Why did you never tell me your wife was like this?" Rachel whispered to Richard, her voice loaded with accusation. "Like what?" Richard asked. though he knew exactly what she meant. Like this, elegant, sophisticated. Everyone here adores her. You made me believe she was a plain woman. Richard had no answer because he had spent months lying, not just to Rachel, but to himself. He had convinced himself that Allison was inferior to justify his betrayal, but now he was being forced to face reality. It was at that moment that Allison turned in the direction of their table. Her eyes met Richard's across the room, and for a moment that seemed to last an eternity, they simply looked at each other. Then Allison began walking toward them, and the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. The Palazzo Hotel ballroom had never witnessed a moment of tension so palpable. Allison walked toward Richard's table with the same elegance with which she had circulated the event. But now there was something different in her eyes. It wasn't anger, nor desperation. It was a serene determination that made every step look calculated, every movement charged with purpose. Richard felt as if the world were moving in slow motion. Every second that passed increased the pressure in his chest. Every step Allison took toward him made him feel smaller in his chair. He could feel the curious gazes from other tables turning toward them, people realizing that something important was about to happen. Rachel, beside him, was visibly nervous. She had spent the entire night trying to establish herself as the important woman in Richard's life. But now she faced the reality that his true wife was approaching. And this wife was nothing like what she had imagined. "Richard," Rachel whispered urgently. "Are you going to talk to her? What are you going to say?" But Richard couldn't answer. He was hypnotized by the sight of Allison approaching. The gold dress caught the light with every step, creating an almost ethereal glow around her. It was as if she were a goddess descending from Olympus to judge insignificant mortals. Dr. Peterson and Helen observed the scene with ill-disguised interest. Charles and Marcia Drummond had stopped eating and were clearly waiting to see how the situation would unfold. Other people at nearby tables also noticed the attention and lowered the volume of their conversations. When Allison finally reached the table, she stopped behind the empty chair next to Richard, the place that should have been hers since the beginning of the night. The silence that fell was absolute. Not even the sound of waiters serving other tables could be heard. Allison looked around the table, greeting each person with an elegant nod of her head. When her eyes rested on Rachel, there was no hostility, only a calm and calculated evaluation. "Good evening, everyone," Allison said, her voice clear and controlled. "I apologize for the late arrival. I had some last-minute commitments that were resolved only today." "Doctor." Peterson was the first to stand up, always the gentleman. "Allison, my dear, what an immense joy to have you here. Please, sit with us." Helen also stood up, smiling warmly. "We were commenting earlier about your absence. So glad you could come." Charles and Marcia followed suit, standing up to greet Allison properly. The politeness and respect they showed her created a glaring contrast with the way they had treated Rachel all night. "Thank you very much for the warm welcome," Allison replied, occupying the chair Dr. Peterson had pulled out for her. "It is always a pleasure to be among such dear friends." Richard finally managed to move, awkwardly standing up to greet his wife. His hands trembled as he leaned in to kiss her cheek, a mechanical gesture they both had repeated thousands of times, but which now felt loaded with embarrassment. "Allison," he said, his voice coming out hoarser than he intended. You managed to come." "As you can see," she replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I decided I couldn't miss the association's most important event of the year." It was then that Rachel decided to intrude into the conversation. She stood up from her chair with an exaggerated movement, extending her hand to Allison with a forced smile. "Hi, you must be the famous Allison. I'm Rachel Oliver, Richard's executive assistant. He talks about you a lot." The moment was tense. Allison looked at Rachel's extended hand, then at her face. and finally accepted the greeting with a frozen politeness. "Executive assistant," Allison repeated slowly, as if savoring the words. How interesting. Richard never mentioned having hired an executive assistant. Rachel felt the first sign that she had completely underestimated the situation. There was something in the way Allison spoke, in the controlled but cutting tone, that made her realize she was dealing with someone much smarter than she expected. "Well, it's a new position." Richard decided he needed someone to help with the most important commitments, Rachel replied, trying to sound casual, but failing miserably. "Ah, I see," Allison nodded, sitting gracefully. "And have you had experience in the business world for a long time?" The question was apparently innocent, but there was a knife hidden in the words. Rachel felt her face heat up, because she knew her experience was limited, and she was sure Allison knew it too. "I'm learning a lot from Richard. He's an excellent mentor," Rachel replied, trying to shift the focus. "I'm sure he is," Allison agreed, casting a significant look at her husband. Richard has always been generous in sharing his knowledge. The double meaning did not go unnoticed by anyone at the table. Dr. Peterson cleared his throat discreetly. Helen looked down at her plate, and Charles and Marcia exchanged a worried look. It was Helen who broke the tension, skillfully changing the subject. "Allison, I must say you look absolutely stunning tonight. That dress is a work of art." "Thank you very much, Helen. Actually, it was a gift from Richard on our 10th wedding anniversary," Allison replied, smoothing the gold fabric. "He said he wanted me to have something special for important occasions. I thought today would be perfect to wear it." The information dropped like a bomb on the table. Richard remembered perfectly giving the dress to Allison. He remembered saying she should save it for special moments. What he didn't remember was having canceled the anniversary dinner for which she had bought the dress, claiming work problems. Rachel also processed the information with growing discomfort. For months, Richard had made her believe his marriage was dead. No romance, no connection. But there was the proof that he had given expensive and romantic gifts to his wife. 12 years of marriage, Peterson commented with approval. "It's an admirable achievement these days. You two are an example for younger couples." "Actually, it'll be 12 years next month," Allison corrected softly. "It has been an interesting journey, full of lessons about human nature and about the true values in life." Every word was loaded with meaning. Richard knew she wasn't just making social conversation. She was sending a direct message to him and to anyone who was paying attention. The dinner continued, but the table dynamic had changed completely. Allison dominated the conversations with natural ease, demonstrating knowledge about art, politics, and international economics. When Dr. Peterson mentioned his expansion plans for the hospital network, she asked intelligent questions about sustainability and corporate social responsibility. "You have an impressive knowledge of hospital management, Allison," Dr. Peterson commented, clearly impressed. "Have you ever thought about working in the healthcare field?" "Actually, I've been doing volunteer work at the medical center for 3 years," Allison replied naturally. "I help organize fundraising campaigns and manage social projects. It's very rewarding to be able to contribute to important causes." Rachel almost choked on her wine. This was yet another piece of information Richard had never shared. For months, he had painted a portrait of Allison as a woman, without ambitions, who spent her days taking care of the house. But the reality was completely different. "How wonderful!" Helen exclaimed. "I've always admired people who dedicate time to helping others. It's a rare quality these days." "I believe we all have a responsibility to contribute to a better society," Allison replied, "especially those who were lucky enough to have a comfortable life." Again, there was a subliminal message in her words. Rachel was beginning to realize that every phrase of Allison's was carefully constructed to convey multiple layers of meaning. Charles Drummond, who had remained relatively quiet during the night, decided to join the conversation. "Allison, it's been a while since we talked about your personal projects. "How is the master's degree going?" Richard almost spat out his wine. What master's degree? He didn't know Allison was doing a master's. "It's going very well. Thank you for asking," Allison replied, casting a discreet look at Richard. "I'm in the final semester of my master's in business administration. My dissertation is on ethical leadership in corporate environments, a topic I consider increasingly relevant." The silence that followed was charged with tension. Everyone at the table, except Rachel, understood the irony of the situation. There was Richard, worried that his wife was too simple for business events, discovering that she was about to graduate with an MBA. "How interesting," Rachel commented, trying to participate in the conversation. "And what exactly do you plan to do with that master's?" Allison turned to look directly at Rachel, and for the first time that night, there was something sharp in her eyes. "I plan to use my knowledge to identify and expose unethical behaviors in the corporate world," she replied slowly, "especially those related to breach of trust, dishonesty, and abuse of power." The message was crystal clear. Rachel felt a shiver run down her spine, and Richard seemed to shrink in his chair. Dr. Peterson, who had observed the entire interaction with growing interest, decided to intervene. "Allison, it would be an honor to have someone with your training and values working with us. If there's interest, I'd like to talk about opportunities in our hospital network." The job offer came like a lightning bolt in a clear sky. Richard realized he had completely underestimated not only Allison's intelligence, but also the respect she commanded in the business community. "I greatly appreciate the offer, Dr. Peterson. It will certainly be a pleasure to talk about it," Allison replied with a genuine smile. "I've always admired the social work your network develops." It was at this moment that Rachel made her biggest mistake of the night. Irritated by the attention Allison was receiving and realizing she was losing ground, she decided to force a situation she thought she could control. "You know, Allison, Richard told me you two are going through some problems in your marriage. He said you barely speak at home." The silence that followed was deafening. All conversations at nearby tables seemed to stop simultaneously. Dr. Peterson looked at Rachel with an expression of shock and disapproval. Helen covered her mouth with her hand. Charles and Marcia simply looked at Rachel as if she had just committed a sacrilege. Allison, however, maintained perfect composure. She turned slowly to look at Rachel, then at Richard, and finally back to Rachel. "How curious," she said, her voice maintaining the same polite tone as before. "Because Richard and I talked yesterday about plans for our vow renewal next month. He said he was looking forward to reaffirming our commitments to each other." The lie was told with such naturalness that, for a moment, even Richard almost believed it. But the impact on the people at the table was devastating. Rachel turned pale, realizing she had gotten into a situation much larger than she could handle. "Vow renewal," Helen repeated with enthusiasm. "How romantic! 12 years, and still so in love." Allison smiled, but her eyes remained fixed on Rachel. "It's true. Some things are worth preserving, no matter how many obstacles appear in the way." The night had become a silent battle between two women, but it was clear to everyone who was winning. The rest of the dinner proceeded in an atmosphere of palpable tension. Rachel had completely lost her confidence after the disastrous comment about Richard's marriage problems. She now kept silent, drinking more wine than she should. Allison, on the other hand, continued dominating the conversations with a natural elegance that made everyone at the table gravitate toward her. When the orchestra began to play and couples headed to the dance floor, Dr. Peterson stood up and extended his hand to Helen. "My dear, may I have this dance?" Charles and Marcia followed suit, leaving Richard, Allison, and Rachel alone at the table. The silence between the three was deafening, loaded with everything that had been said and everything that remained unsaid. Rachel looked at her wine glass, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Throughout the night, she had noticed how her presence was being questioned, how people looked at her with ill-disguised disapproval, and worse yet, how Richard seemed increasingly distant and embarrassed. "I need to go to the bathroom," Rachel murmured, standing up from the table unsteadily. She had drunk too much, and it was evident in the way she walked. When Rachel moved away, Richard and Allison were left alone for the first time that night. The silence stretched for several minutes, while the orchestra music filled the space between them. 12 years, Allison said finally, looking at the ring on her finger. 12 years of marriage, Richard, and in all those years, I never thought the day would come when you would replace me with an executive assistant. Richard closed his eyes, feeling the full weight of his choices. "Allison, No," she interrupted him softly. "Let me speak first. For months, I felt I was losing you, that there was something wrong, that you were drifting away. I tried to talk, I tried to understand, I tried to be the wife I thought you wanted." She paused, looking around the ballroom where they were still admired as one of the association's solidest couples. "Then I found out about her, about Rachel, and do you know what hurt me most? It wasn't just the betrayal, it was discovering that you had told her I was inadequate for your world, that I was too simple, without enough sophistication." Richard felt as if he were being torn apart inside. Every word of Allison's was a knife to his conscience. "But tonight, Richard, you saw the truth. You saw how people really see me. Dr. Peterson offered me a job. Helen invited me to her charity board. Charles and Marcia treated me with the respect they've always had for me." Allison turned to look directly into his eyes. "And your girlfriend? How did she do tonight? How was she received by the people you so much wanted to impress?" Richard couldn't answer because the truth was too painful. Rachel had been a complete disaster. Every word that came out of her mouth had diminished the respect people had for him. Every vulgar gesture, every inappropriate comment had been a source of embarrassment. "I am an idiot," he whispered finally. "A complete idiot." "Yes, you are," Allison agreed without hesitation. "But the question now is what you intend to do about it." Before Richard could answer, Rachel returned from the bathroom, clearly even more intoxicated than when she had left. She leaned on the table with more force than necessary, making the glasses clink. "Sorry for the delay," she said, her voice slightly slurred. "I ran into some women in the bathroom who were talking about you two." Allison and Richard looked at each other, both realizing that Rachel was about to create another embarrassing scene. "They were saying you're the perfect couple, that you have an enviable marriage," Rachel continued, sitting heavily in the chair. "I thought it was funny, considering Richard spends most of his time with me lately." The comment was like a bomb exploding at the table. Several people at nearby tables looked in their direction, clearly overhearing the conversation. Allison maintained her composure, but Richard saw a dangerous flame ignite in her eyes. "Rachel," Richard said urgently, "I think you'd better stop drinking." "Why? I'm just being honest," she replied, raising her wine glass again. "Or are you ashamed of the truth?" It was at this moment that Allison made a decision. She stood up gracefully from her chair and turned to Rachel with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You know, Rachel, you're right. Honesty is very important. So I'm going to be completely honest with you." The room seemed to have grown quieter around them. It was as if people could feel something important was about to happen. "During these months in which you thought you were winning over my husband, I was doing some interesting things. I finished my master's with the highest grade. I received a job offer from one of the city's most respected companies. And more importantly," Allison paused, allowing the tension to grow, "I hired one of the city's best family lawyers and documented every lie, every betrayal, every cent of our company money that was spent on you." Rachel turned pale instantly. Richard felt as if the floor had opened beneath his feet. "While you thought you were building a future with a married man, I was building a solid case to ensure that, when this marriage ended, I would keep everything that rightfully belongs to me." The silence at the table was absolute. Rachel looked at Allison as if she were seeing a ghost. Richard was in total shock, realizing he had completely underestimated his wife's intelligence and determination. But you know what's interesting, Rachel? Allison continued, her voice maintaining its polite and controlled tone. After seeing you tonight, observing how you behave, how you speak, how you treat people, I realize that you are already punishment enough for any man. Dr. Peterson and Helen had returned from the dance floor and witnessed the final moments of the conversation. Helen covered her mouth with her hand, clearly shocked, while Dr. Peterson observed the scene with a mixture of admiration and concern. Rachel tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. She was starting to realize the magnitude of the mistake she had made, not just in getting involved with a married man, but in completely underestimating the woman she was competing with. I didn't know, Rachel stammered. Of course you didn't, Allison agreed. Because you two created a fantasy where I was the villain of the story, where I was the boring, plain wife who was preventing your great love. Allison turned to Richard, who was pale as a corpse. But reality is different, isn't it, Richard? The reality is that you had the most loyal, intelligent, and elegant woman by your side for 12 years, and you threw it all away for a cheap illusion. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but Allison raised her hand. Now you have a choice to make. You can continue with this farce. You can keep pretending that Rachel is what you really want. Or you can try to be man enough to admit the colossal mistake you made. Dr. Peterson approached the table, clearly concerned about the situation. Allison, my dear, is everything okay? Everything is perfect, Dr. Peterson, she replied with a genuine smile. Just clarifying some pending issues. Rachel, realizing she had become the center of extremely negative attention, decided it was time to leave. She stood up from her chair unsteadily, grabbed her purse, and looked at Richard. Are you just going to sit there, letting her humiliate me like this? Richard looked at Rachel, then at Allison, then at the people around observing the scene. For the first time in months, he saw everything with total clarity. He saw Rachel as she really was, vulgar, manipulative, inadequate for any situation that required class or sophistication. And he saw Allison as she had always been, extraordinary. Rachel, he said slowly, I think you'd better go home. The response was like a slap in her face. Rachel looked at Richard with incredulity, then at Allison with pure hatred. You're going to regret this, Richard, she said, her voice trembling with anger. When you realize you made a mistake, don't come after me. Don't worry, Richard responded, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. I won't. Rachel left the ballroom, stumbling slightly, leaving a trail of embarrassment behind her. Several people watched her leave, whispering among themselves about what they had witnessed. When she disappeared, Richard turned to Allison. There were tears in his eyes, tears of regret, of shame, of late recognition of what he had lost. Allison, Richard, she interrupted him softly. If you really want a chance to rebuild what you destroyed, you're going to have to do more than apologize. You're going to have to prove you understood the value of what you threw away. Dr. Peterson, who had observed the whole interaction, approached Richard and placed a hand on his shoulder. Young man, you have the most extraordinary woman in this city by your side. If I were you, I would do everything to deserve a second chance. Richard looked around the ballroom and realized dozens of people were watching them, some with curiosity, others with judgment, but many with expectation, as if they were waiting to see what he would do next. He stood up slowly and extended his hand to Allison. Will you grant me this dance? Allison looked at him for several seconds, evaluating the sincerity in the request. Finally, she accepted his hand and stood up. One dance, nothing more. They walked to the dance floor as the orchestra played a slow waltz. When Richard placed his hand on Allison's waist, and she rested her hand on his shoulder, it was as if the years of distancing hadn't existed. You look beautiful tonight, Richard whispered as they danced. I'm always beautiful, Richard. You're the one who stopped noticing. They danced in silence for a few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Around them, other couples also danced. But many eyes were still fixed on them. "What you said about having documented everything, was it true?" Richard finally asked. "Every word," Allison replied without hesitation. "I am not the naive woman you thought I was, Richard. I never was." "And the lawyer?" "Mr. Mark Santoro, the best in the city. He said I would be entitled to 60% of everything we built together, considering the circumstances." Richard swallowed hard. Mr. Santoro had a reputation for being ruthless in divorce cases. And now? What happens now? Allison stopped dancing and looked directly into his eyes. "Now you're going home alone. You're going to reflect on the choices you made and the man you've become. And if after an honest reflection, you decide you want to fight for our marriage, you're going to have to prove it." "How?" "First, you will definitively end all contact with Rachel. Second, we are going to do couples therapy. Third, you are going to have to rebuild my trust from scratch, knowing that I hold all the cards." Richard nodded, understanding that Allison was giving him an opportunity he didn't deserve. "And if I can't? If you decide the damage was too great?" Allison smiled, but it was a sad smile. "Then you will discover what it's like to live without the best thing that ever happened in your life." The music ended, and they separated. Allison kissed Richard's cheek lightly, a gesture that was observed by the whole ballroom. "Good night, Richard. See you when you decide what kind of man you want to be." She walked away, greeted Dr. Peterson and Helen, said goodbye to Charles and Marcia, and left the ballroom with the same elegance with which she had entered. Richard stood in the middle of the dance floor, watching the most extraordinary woman he knew disappear through the door. Around him, people gradually returned to their conversations, but he knew it would be a topic of gossip for weeks. Dr. Peterson approached him one last time. "Richard, I'm going to give you some advice, man to man. That woman who just left here is a rare diamond. If you are smart enough to do what is necessary to win her back, you will be the luckiest man in the world. If you aren't, well, she'll be fine without you." 6 months later, Richard and Allison were in the same church where they had married 12 years before, but this time to renew their vows. The ceremony was small, intimate, only with close family and their dearest friends. Richard had fulfilled all the conditions Allison had set. He ended it definitively with Rachel the day after the event. They went to couples therapy religiously every week, and he spent months proving he understood the value of the extraordinary woman he had by his side. It wasn't easy. Allison made him work hard to regain her trust. But in the process, Richard rediscovered why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. And more importantly, he discovered aspects of her he had never noticed before. When they exchanged renewed vows, Richard looked into Allison's eyes and said the words he had been practicing for months. "Allison, I promise I will never again forget that I have the most extraordinary woman in the world by my side. I promise to honor you, respect you, and never again take for granted the gift that is having you in my life." Allison smiled, tears streaming down her face, and responded, "And I promise that I will never again allow anyone to make me feel less than what I know I'm worth. I promise to fight for our love, but I also promise to fight for myself." When they kissed, sealing their vow renewal, there was a feeling that something had been not only restored, but strengthened. Dr. Peterson, who was invited to the ceremony, commented to Helen, "Now we truly have back the couple we always admired." And in a decision that surprised everyone, Allison accepted the job offer at Dr. Peterson's hospital network, becoming the director of social responsibility. Richard not only supported the decision, but took immense pride in his wife's professional successes. As for Rachel, she had left town a few weeks after the hotel event, claiming to have gotten a better job in another state. But everyone knew she had left because she could no longer look people in the eye after the public humiliation she suffered. Sometimes, when they walked hand in hand through the city streets, Richard looked at Allison and still couldn't believe he had almost lost everything for a cheap illusion. But he had learned the most important lesson of his life, that some people are irreplaceable, and recognizing that before it's too late is the difference between being a wise man and being a fool. And Allison, in turn, had discovered that knowing her own value and never accepting less than she deserves is not just a matter of self-esteem, but of self-preservation. She became an even stronger woman, more confident, and more determined to never allow anyone to diminish her again. In the end, the night that could have destroyed her marriage ended up being the night that saved it. Because sometimes, to build something new and better, first it is necessary for everything to fall apart and show its true foundations.